Germany was Europe's industrial powerhouse for 75 years. Then they made energy choices that turned them into one of the world's worst economic performers. Volkswagen is shutting German plants for the first time in history. BASF is closing factories and moving production abroad. Mercedes is investing billions in America instead of Germany. The nuclear plants went dark in April 2023. Now the bills are coming due, and they're staggering. This isn't about politics or climate debates. This is about how hidden energy decisions quietly reshape the economics that keep nations wealthy. Germany didn't collapse overnight. They made a series of choices that seemed logical at the time. Each decision felt reasonable in isolation. The Energiewende policy promised a clean energy future, phase out nuclear power, end coal dependence, build massive wind and solar capacity, 80% renewables by 2030. It sounded like progress. But here's what planners missed. Factories need power that's both cheap and constant. Steel mills can't pause when the wind stops blowing. Chemical plants can't wait for sunny days. The industrial backbone that made Germany Europe's manufacturing giant runs on predictable energy flows. When the final nuclear reactors shut down in April 2023, Germany lost its most reliable baseload power source. At the same time, Russian gas supplies became unreliable and expensive. Suddenly, the country was running on intermittent renewables and costly imported fuel. The math became brutal. Energy costs that had stayed competitive for decades started climbing, 2 times higher, 3 times higher in some sectors. Companies that had operated profitably in Germany for generations began looking at their spreadsheets and making difficult calculations about where to build their next factory. Here's how Germany painted itself into a corner. The Energiewende wasn't just about adding solar panels and wind turbines. It was about systematically dismantling the country's most reliable power sources while betting everything on weather-dependent alternatives. Think of it like this. You have a reliable old car that gets you to work every day. Instead of keeping it as backup, you sell it and buy an electric bike. The bike works great when it's sunny and the battery is charged. But when it rains or the power goes out, you're stranded. Germany made 3 critical moves simultaneously. First, they scheduled the shutdown of every nuclear reactor by 2023. These plants provided steady, carbon-free electricity 24 hours a day, regardless of weather. Second, they planned to eliminate coal by 2038, removing another baseload source. Third, they doubled down on Russian gas as a bridge fuel to fill the gaps. Each decision seemed logical in isolation. Nuclear had public opposition after Fukushima. Coal was dirty. Russian gas was cheap and burned cleaner than coal. But together, they created what energy analysts call an intermittency mismatch. Here's the problem most people don't understand about industrial electricity. A chemical plant can't just pause production when the wind stops blowing. Steel furnaces can't wait for cloudy days to pass. These facilities need consistent power flowing at predictable prices. They plan their operations years in advance based on stable energy costs. When Germany shut down its last 3 nuclear plants in April 2023, they eliminated 11 gigawatts of reliable capacity. That's enough to power 10 million homes. The timing couldn't have been worse. Russian gas supplies had become unreliable and expensive after the Ukraine conflict. Suddenly, Germany was importing liquefied natural gas at spot market prices, sometimes 3 times more expensive than their old contracts. The renewable build-out wasn't keeping pace with the shutdowns. Wind and solar were growing, but the grid infrastructure couldn't handle the variability. On calm, cloudy days, Germany had to fire up expensive gas plants or import electricity from neighbors. On windy, sunny days, they sometimes produced too much power and had to pay other countries to take the excess. Meanwhile, German factories were getting their monthly electricity bills and watching their competitive advantages evaporate. Companies that had operated profitably for decades suddenly found themselves paying energy costs that made production in Germany economically impossible. The industrial exodus was about to begin. The headlines started appearing in late 2023. BASF, Germany's largest chemical company and a cornerstone of the nation's industrial base, announced plant closures and massive layoffs. Not expansion, not temporary shutdowns, permanent closures, with production moving to countries where energy costs made business viable. This wasn't supposed to happen. BASF had operated in Germany for over 150 years. They survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and multiple recessions, but they couldn't survive energy prices that made their products uncompetitive in global markets. The company's executives were blunt in their announcements. High energy costs were forcing difficult decisions. Chemical production is extremely energy-intensive. When electricity and gas prices doubled or tripled, profit margins didn't just shrink, they disappeared entirely. Plants that had employed thousands of workers were becoming financial disasters. Volkswagen followed with an unprecedented announcement. For the first time in the company's 87-year history, they were shutting down plants in Germany, not expanding in Germany while building elsewhere, actually closing German facilities and moving production to the United States, where energy costs remained competitive. Mercedes-Benz made similar moves. They announced billions in investments for new U.S. manufacturing facilities while scaling back German operations. The automotive giant cited rising costs and lack of competitiveness as primary factors. These weren't expansion moves. They were survival strategies. The pattern became clear across multiple industries. Aluminum smelters shut down because electricity costs made production impossible. Glass manufacturers moved operations to regions with cheaper energy. Even smaller manufacturers began relocating to countries where they could operate profitably. Here's what made this exodus particularly devastating. These weren't just factory jobs disappearing. These were anchor companies that supported entire supply chains. When BASF closes a chemical plant, it affects dozens of smaller suppliers, logistics companies, and service providers. When Volkswagen shuts a facility, the ripple effects spread through the entire regional economy. German workers who had built careers in these industries found themselves facing an impossible choice: follow their jobs to other countries or retrain for entirely different sectors. Many had spent decades developing specialized skills that were suddenly worth more in Tennessee or Texas than in Bavaria or Baden-Württemberg. The numbers told a stark story. Germany's industrial production began declining while competitors gained market share. Companies that had chosen Germany for its engineering expertise and manufacturing quality were now choosing other locations for basic economic survival. What had taken 75 years to build was unraveling in just a few years of policy missteps. The true scale of Germany's energy gamble became clear when economists calculated the price tag: $737 billion. That's what it will cost to rebuild Germany's power grid by 2045 to handle 80% renewables by 2030. Think about that number for a moment. $737 billion to fix a problem that didn't exist before they dismantled their reliable energy system. It's like tearing down a perfectly good house and then discovering the replacement costs 10 times more than expected. But here's what makes this even more devastating. Energy experts are now questioning whether the 2045 climate neutrality targets are even realistic. Henning Gloystein from Eurasia Group points to a fundamental problem. Germany still relies heavily on natural gas, and those high energy costs aren't going away anytime soon. The S&P Global Energy team, led by Andreas Franke, published a report that industry insiders call a reality check. They're demanding revised electricity forecasts because the current renewable targets simply don't match the physical and economic constraints of the German energy system. Meanwhile, German households and businesses are living with the consequences right now. LNG terminals are expanding across the country as a bridge fuel to keep the grid stable while renewables scale up. But LNG comes at spot market prices, volatile, expensive, and completely dependent on global supply chains that Germany can't control. The irony is staggering. Germany spent decades building energy independence through nuclear power and local coal. Now, they're more dependent on energy imports than ever before. They're paying premium prices for liquefied natural gas shipped from thousands of miles away, while their domestic nuclear plants sit permanently shuttered. Industrial leaders are watching these numbers and making cold calculations about the future. If grid expansion costs $737 billion and energy prices remain 3 times higher than competitors, what's the long-term outlook for German manufacturing? The Baker Institute researchers who studied Germany's transition for lessons the United States could learn were blunt in their assessment. They called the nuclear shutdown and Russian gas dependence clear missteps that weakened the German economy at precisely the wrong moment. Here's the most sobering part of their analysis. They found that Germany has transformed from Europe's economic powerhouse into one of the world's worst economic performers among major developed nations. 75 years of industrial leadership unraveled by energy policy decisions made in just a few critical years. The question isn't whether Germany can afford $737 billion for grid expansion. The question is whether they can afford not to spend it, knowing that their industrial base continues shrinking every month they delay. But even if they spend every dollar, will it be enough to bring back the companies that have already left? As of early 2026, Germany remains in a state of economic uncertainty that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. The persistent GDP stagnation continues. Industrial weakness shows no signs of reversing. The manufacturing base that defined German prosperity for 3 generations is fundamentally altered. There's something particularly striking in the energy consumption data. Primary energy demand has dropped 20% since 1990, while GDP grew 50%. At first glance, that looks like remarkable efficiency gains. But dig deeper and a more troubling picture emerges. Part of that demand reduction isn't efficiency, it's the loss of energy-intensive industry itself. When BASF closes chemical plants and Volkswagen shuts facilities, they're not just relocating jobs. They're relocating the entire industrial ecosystem that made those regions economically viable. The skilled workers, the supplier networks, the technical expertise, all of it moves with the production lines. The Energiewende experiment continues, but the timeline for success keeps extending while the costs keep climbing. The 80% renewables target for 2030 now faces serious scrutiny from the same analysts who originally supported the transition. The climate neutrality goal for 2045 is openly questioned by energy experts who see no realistic path to eliminate gas dependence. Germany still leads the world in engineering excellence and industrial innovation, but leadership in those areas means nothing if the economic foundation makes domestic production unviable. Other countries are learning from Germany's experience, some as a model to follow, others as a cautionary tale to avoid. The most important lesson from Germany's energy choices isn't about renewable technology or climate policy. It's about the hidden costs of rapid transitions in complex systems. Energy policy doesn't exist in isolation. Every decision ripples through the entire economic structure of a nation. What seemed like environmental progress turned into industrial regression. What promised energy independence delivered greater import dependence. What targeted climate leadership produced economic decline. The story of Germany's energy transition is still being written. New data emerges every quarter. Industrial relocations continue. Grid expansion projects advance slowly while costs escalate. The final chapter won't be clear for years, possibly decades. But the lessons are already clear for any nation considering similar transitions. Energy choices have consequences that extend far beyond electricity bills. They reshape the fundamental economics that determine where companies build factories, where workers find jobs, and where countries maintain their competitive advantages. Germany's experience shows how quickly those foundations can shift and how difficult they are to rebuild once they're gone. This is just the beginning of a global conversation about energy, industry, and economic competitiveness. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because this story is far from over, and the next chapter might be happening in your own country.